A political firestorm has erupted between Manitoba and Republican lawmakers in the United States, and it's all about wildfire smoke drifting across the border. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew accused a group of Republicans of throwing a timber tantrum and playing political games after they called out Canada over wildfires sending smoke billowing across the international border into their states. But this isn't just diplomatic name-calling. This is a story about climate change, political opportunism, and a cross-border crisis that's turning deadly serious. Let's start with what happened.
There are 3 burning out of control in New Brunswick. Premier Susan Holt is warning there isn't any reprieve coming in the forecast.
We know that the hot, humid, windy weather is going to continue for the foreseeable future. It was hotter today. I think Bathurst recorded higher temperatures than we've seen in some parts of Florida. So we need to take all possible precautions to avoid the spread of the existing fires or the starting of new fires.
The province's Natural Resources Minister says an additional 30 firefighters from Nova Scotia and PEI will be arriving, and some additional help from the state of Maine. There are 5 wildfires burning out of control in Newfoundland and Labrador, including a new, rapidly growing wildfire that Premier John Hogan said could cause power interruptions. He also said the Canadian Armed Forces is deploying 80 firefighters. Eleanor Olszewski is the Minister of Emergency Management and Community Resilience. Thank you very much for joining us. I just want to start with, can you bring us up to speed on what the federal government is doing to assist right now with the raging out-of-control wildfires?
Absolutely, Katie. And let me start off by thanking you very much for having me on the program today. And I would also like to just take a minute to thank the Canadian Armed Forces, first responders, firefighters, everyone that's been actively involved in fighting these terrible wildfires over the last number of weeks, and often putting...
The situation is dire. Fires are burning out of control across multiple provinces, with New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador facing particularly severe conditions. Hot, humid, and windy weather continues to fuel these blazes, with some Canadian cities recording temperatures higher than parts of Florida. The Canadian Armed Forces has deployed 80 firefighters to assist, while neighboring provinces send support. Against this backdrop of genuine emergency, a husband and wife were killed by a fast-moving wildfire northeast of Winnipeg in May, and thousands have been evacuated from their communities. Manitoba is dealing with a devastating wildfire season, declaring a state of emergency for the 2nd time this year, while trying to contain fires that have been burning across the province. But instead of receiving sympathy or offers of cooperation, Kinew found himself under attack from a group of Republican politicians who decided Canada's wildfire crisis was their political opportunity. In a Wednesday news release, Wisconsin State Representative Calvin Callahan joined other Republican state lawmakers from Iowa, Minnesota, and North Dakota in filing a formal complaint against Canada to U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lee Zeldin and the International Joint Commission, a binational organization that resolves disputes on shared water and air quality. The Republican lawmakers called for an investigation of Canada's wildfire management practices and for potential remedies under international law. But here's where it gets interesting. If Canada can't get these wildfires under control, they need to face real consequences, Callahan said in the news release. We won't sit back while our air becomes a health hazard. This sounds reasonable on the surface, until you dig deeper into what's really going on here. Kinew didn't hold back in his response. These are attention seekers who can't come up with a good idea on health care or on making life more affordable, Kinew told the Canadian press. So they're playing games with something that's very serious. The Premier's frustration is understandable when you consider the broader context of what's happening. Last Thursday, 6 of the 10 worst air quality readings in the entire country were right here in Wisconsin. The smoke is real and the health impacts are genuine. Our workers, families, and kids can't afford to breathe toxic air day after day, Callahan said. But there's a crucial difference between acknowledging a legitimate health concern and exploiting it for political gain. What makes this story particularly revealing is the timing and the broader political context. The increasing pressure from Republicans comes as the bilateral relationship between the two countries remains tense. On August 1st, U.S. President Donald Trump boosted tariffs on Canadian goods to 35%, after a new security and economic agreement failed to materialize ahead of the president's deadline. Canada is also being hit with Trump's steel, aluminum, copper, and automobile tariffs. So we have Republican lawmakers filing formal complaints about wildfire smoke at the exact moment when Trump is escalating trade tensions with Canada.
No, I'm not worried about that because that's never going to happen. We'll be your closest ally and closest friend for forever, as we have been for 200 years. And we will outlast the Trump administration, and we'll continue working with our great American partners.
What's the general impression of Trump in Canada?
He's probably the most disliked politician in the world in Canada because he's attacked his closest family member, and that's the way we look upon it. And when I talk to the governors and senators and Congress people, even Republicans totally disagree, but they're too scared to come out and say anything because the president will go after them, outside of a few senators. And I want to thank them for coming out and standing with not just American people, but their closest friends and allies, which is Canada. And again, we love the Americans. It's unfortunate President Trump decided to go down this road.
The broader pattern couldn't be clearer. This is about politics, not public health. Even Republican governors and senators privately disagree with these tactics but are too scared to speak out. The human cost is real. 37,000 Americans have lost manufacturing jobs since April, the lowest employment rate in 5 years. These families can't pay rent, can't pay mortgages, can't put food on their tables. And yet, instead of addressing these economic disasters, Republican lawmakers are filing complaints about Canadian wildfire management. Coincidence? Kinew doesn't think so, and frankly, neither should we. But here's what makes Kinew's response so powerful. He didn't just fire back with rhetoric. He pointed to the reality of cross-border cooperation that actually exists. "I've shaken the hands of American firefighters in northern Manitoba who are helping us out," said Premier Wab Kinew, whose province has endured a deadly and devastating wildfire season in which thousands of people have been forced to evacuate from their homes. He noted that American firefighters have been helping to fight Canada's wildfires, and Canadian firefighters were on the ground and in the air during California's devastating wildfire season. This is the reality that the Republican grandstanding completely ignores. While politicians are filing complaints and making demands, actual firefighters, American and Canadian, are working together to save lives and property. I've thanked them, and I thanked folks in the Trump administration who sent some of the federal firefighting resources up to Canada and to Manitoba, Kinew said. So we're going to have a continued relationship and an ability to support each other through wildfires going forward. The Premier was careful to distinguish between the politicians and the people. Kinew said he doesn't generalize these attention seekers' misguided words to all Americans. This is diplomatic language, but it's also strategic. Kinew is isolating the political opportunists while maintaining relationships with Americans who are actually helping. Now let's talk about the science that these Republican complaints conveniently ignore. Research shows that climate change, largely driven by fossil fuel use, is exacerbating wildfires in both Canada and the United States. Lightning causes about half of them and burns the most area, per the Canadian National Fire Database. While a proportion of wildfires is caused by human activity, like unattended campfires, and a Quebec man pleaded guilty to arson last year after he was arrested for igniting 14 fires, there's no indication that widespread arson is behind the wildfires. But the Republican lawmakers aren't interested in science. The representatives ask how the federal government plans to mitigate the wildfire smoke, attributing a lack of active forest management as a major driver of Canadian wildfires, and suggesting that some of the fires began with arson. This is classic climate denial disguised as policy criticism. The broader pattern here is clear. Callahan joins a chorus of Republican politicians at other levels of government who have been voicing concerns about Canada's wildfires. Michigan Representative Jack Bergman sent a letter to Canadian Senator Michael MacDonald on Monday, calling for stronger forest management policies and more accountability from Canadian officials. Michigan Representative John James sent a letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney last week saying his constituents are choking on toxic wildfire smoke. But here's what's really telling about this whole situation. I would challenge these ambulance chasers in the U.S., Congress to go and do the same and to hear how much the American firefighting heroes who are here, how much they love our province. While the letter was not addressed to him, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew disparaged the American congressman as ambulance chasers for questioning the Canadian government's history of lackluster responses to out-of-control fires. The term ambulance chasers is particularly apt here. These are politicians who are literally chasing after a natural disaster to score political points. Kinew in July said it turns people off politics when you have got a group of congresspeople trying to trivialize and make hay out of a wildfire season where we've lost lives in our province. Think about that for a moment. People have died in these fires, thousands have been evacuated, communities have been destroyed, and the Republican response is to file formal complaints and demand real consequences for Canada. It's the definition of political opportunism. The scale of the wildfire crisis is genuinely staggering. Currently, according to Natural Resources Canada, the Canadian government has documented 2,672 fires in 2025, with 354 of them still active as of Thursday and 105 of them designated uncontrolled. Some of the fires, reports in Canadian media noted, have been burning since 2023, the worst years for forest fires in recorded Canadian history. That year, 100 million Americans were affected in some way by the fires, with states coast to coast ordering people to stay indoors and wear protective respiratory gear to avoid the detrimental health effects of the fires. But instead of acknowledging this as a shared challenge that requires cooperation, Republican politicians are treating it as a foreign policy issue where Canada needs to face real consequences. It's exactly the kind of zero-sum thinking that makes actual problem-solving impossible. Northwood's Congressman Tom Tiffany earlier this week suggested a tariff on Canada until they do something about the fires and the smoke that is wafting across the border. Because apparently the solution to a climate crisis is more trade wars. Meanwhile, the actual experts are telling us something completely different. Lightning-caused fires are often in remote areas that are difficult to get to and then very difficult to control, said Laurie Daniels, a wildfire scientist at the University of British Columbia. Its Department of Forest and Conservation. Natural Resources Canada told CBC News via an emailed statement that Canadian firefighters, first responders, and volunteers continue to work tirelessly to protect lives and property from the present wildfires. The department said it actively collaborates with provinces, territories, Indigenous communities, and international partners to address the impacts of wildfires. This is the reality that the Republican complaints ignore. Canada isn't sitting around doing nothing while fires burn. They're fighting them with everything they have, including help from American firefighters. The idea that filing formal complaints and demanding consequences is going to somehow make lightning-caused fires in remote areas easier to control is absurd. But here's the most important part of this story. It's not really about wildfire smoke at all. It's about the broader pattern of how Republican politicians are using every crisis, every challenge, every inconvenience as an opportunity to attack their political opponents and score cheap points with their base. The wildfire smoke is real. The health impacts are genuine. The frustration of people in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other affected states is completely understandable. But turning this into a political weapon against Canada, especially at a time when the two countries need to be working together on climate change, is exactly the kind of short-sighted thinking that makes real solutions impossible. Kinew's timber tantrum comment isn't just a clever turn of phrase. It's an accurate description of politicians throwing a fit instead of doing the hard work of actual governance. Premier Kinew may call me an ambulance chaser, but I'm working to make sure my constituents with respiratory concerns don't end up in one because of his wildfire smoke, one Republican responded. But filing formal complaints isn't working to solve anything. It's performing for the cameras. The broader context here is crucial. We're living through a period of unprecedented climate change. Wildfires are getting worse, not just in Canada, but globally. The smoke doesn't respect borders, and neither do the underlying causes. This is exactly the kind of challenge that requires international cooperation, shared resources, and coordinated responses. Instead, we get Republican politicians treating it like a trade dispute and demanding consequences for a neighboring country that's dealing with a natural disaster. It's the opposite of leadership, and it's exactly why so many people are losing faith in politics. Kinew's response shows what actual leadership looks like. He acknowledged the legitimate concerns about air quality. He thanked the American firefighters who are actually helping. He distinguished between the politicians and the people. And he called out the opportunism for what it is, attention-seeking behavior from people who can't come up with real solutions to real problems. The timber tantrum is more than just a diplomatic spat. It's a perfect example of how political opportunism makes every crisis worse. While firefighters from both countries are working together to save lives, politicians are filing complaints and making demands. While scientists are explaining the complex realities of climate change and wildfire management, politicians are looking for someone to blame. This is why Kinew's response matters. He's not just defending Canada, he's defending the idea that some things are too important for political games. When people's lives are at stake, when communities are burning, when the very air we breathe is at risk, we need leaders who can rise above partisan opportunism and focus on actual solutions. The Republican timber tantrum over wildfire smoke is ultimately a story about what happens when politics becomes more important than problem solving. And Kinew's response is a reminder that real leadership means calling out that behavior, even when it's diplomatically uncomfortable to do so. The smoke will eventually clear, the fires will eventually be contained, but the pattern of political opportunism that turns every crisis into a chance to score points. That's the real threat to our ability to address the challenges we're facing, and that's why Kinew's willingness to call it out matters far beyond this particular dispute.